Hi everyone, welcome to Tales of Dread. In the summer of 1925, a Polish family set out on a planned hike through one of the country's beautiful mountainous areas, but the weather was unusually bad. What happened to them after that is still a mystery. This week, we will look into the mystery of the Tatra Mountains. The lone hiker stopped in the middle of the clearing, slung his pack over his shoulder, and dug deep into it to find his extra water canteen. Due to the bad weather of the past few days, the ground beneath his feet was still silent. The air still had a hint of chill, but Mariusz Żurowski had been through much worse. In fact, he had never felt more alive than when he was traveling through this mountainous area. Żurowski was a well-known public figure who had always been a bit restless. He had spent most of his adult life exploring the Tatra mountain ranges' peaks and valleys. The Polish people were going through hard times. Their country was still dealing with the effects of the Great War, and it was hard for them to figure out who they were as a political group. So, the former cavalry officer did everything he could to get away from the hectic demands of his daily life. He spent any free time helping other travelers who might need help. As pretty as this scenery was, it was also a very dangerous place where many hunters and hikers had died over the years due to exposure and other dangers. The night before, while having dinner at a local tavern, he had overheard the story of a family who had still not come back from the mountains. After going on a walk a few days earlier and spending the rest of the day looking at the maps and sketches he had made of the area over the years, Żurowski decided to go to Bald Clearing, which is at the bottom of the Sycamore Valley. Based on his own experience, he thought this was the most likely path the family would have taken after their last reported sighting. Żurowski was standing in quiet thought when he heard movement at the far end of the clearing. A woman slowly emerged from the trees, looking dirty and showing signs of possible hypothermia. Żurowski ran towards the woman but was not fast enough to stop her from falling. He reached for his canteen again, but she grabbed his arm tightly and stopped him. She had wild eyes and looked up at him with a mix of fear and confusion in her eyes. She said something in a mumbled way that he couldn't quite catch. She said that he could only hear her words clearly when he moved closer. "They're gone." The Tatra Mountains cover an area of more than 300 square miles and rise from sea level to make a natural border between Poland and the neighboring country of Slovakia. Their landscape is a bit like that of Alpine mountains, with hills and valleys. The highest part of the Carpathian mountain range, which goes in an arc around Eastern Europe, is in the Tatra region. Most people think that the peaks of the Tatra Mountains are easier to reach, and over the years, both experienced hikers and people who don't know much about winter travel have come to like them. In August 1925, 3 tourists came to the area for a short trip, just as the first 2 groups were coming to an end. Kojima Sneaker, his wife Valeria, and their 12-year-old son had come from the nearby city of Krakow. Kostunica, a criminal prosecutor with a good reputation across the country, had planned to walk with his family through a region called the Sycamore Valley and on to the resort town of Zakopane. The path he chose was almost 16 kilometers long. Most people thought it was easy to walk, but there was a difficult part called the Ice Pass that went up to a height of about 2,500 meters, or just over 8,000 feet. After eating breakfast at a shelter on a hillside in the Valley of the 5 Ponds, the family started their hike early on August 3rd, but the weather turned bad almost right away. At lunchtime, when the wind picked up and the temperature dropped, they met a group of 4 more experienced climbers at one of the mountain shelters and asked to go with them. Even though they agreed at first, 3 of the 4 climbers soon got tired of the new climbers slowing them down so much. This was mostly because Kostunica's glasses kept getting fogged up, so he had to stop and wipe them off before continuing. A few hours further along the trail, the 4 of them stopped. They talked about whether or not they should go on their own and leave the family behind. After a short discussion, Berger was the only one of the group who felt he had to stay with the cat Snickers. The other hikers went up the mountain at their own pace, while Berger stayed behind with Snickers. Later, when the three climbers stopped further up the trail, they turned around and saw the family and Berger getting farther and farther behind them until they were swallowed up by a patch of rolling fog. They weren't seen again for another 2 days, and even after they were found, the question of what happened to them after they were left behind has puzzled people for decades and hasn't been answered to this day. After finding Valeria Sneaker on August 5, Marius Sorosky carried her back down the trail to get medical help before going back up the mountain with the search party. A little further up the Sycamore Valley from where he had found Valeria, Zorowski and his fellow rescuers found the rest of her party dead in an open area called the Frog Pond. Valeria was lying backwards on a rock. Not far from where he was lying against a rock, his dead son was nearby. Both bodies showed no signs of how they had died, which was different from what was left of Berger. His body was spread out far from the other two. He seemed to have hurt his head and broken his arm in a hard fall, but no one could explain what had happened. The army officer took pictures of the scene before telling the men with him to get the bodies and start the slow journey back to civilization. People had hoped that once Valeria woke up and told her story, it would be easier to figure out why the three men had died. However, Valeria's story, told by the prosecutor's wife after she came to, only seemed to make things more confusing. She talked about how their group had moved slowly up the ice pass because the weather and their strength had gotten much worse as they went. In the end, a genius gave in to Berger's pleas, and they all turned around. The four of them started to climb back down the mountain as the wind howled around them. The first sign that danger was coming was when her son started to feel sick and told his mother he couldn't walk any further. He wanted them to hurry to a safe place. Berger gave the boy's pack to Malaria, and then walked down the trail with the boy in his arms. As they got closer to the frog pond, however, a genius fell to his knees and said that he felt very weak. Valeria was about to help him when she heard a worried cry from behind her. When she turned around, she saw Berger fall down. He seemed to be sick in a similar way to her sick husband. As her confusion grew, she quickly turned around and ran back to the climber, helping him and her son get to a nearby boulder for shelter. After she sat them down next to each other, Berger told her that he, too, felt very weak. Malaria gave him some cognac from a hip flask she had brought with her, then gave her son some chocolates before running back to help a genius. Once she had reached her husband, she had given him a sip of the brandy, watching on in helpless panic as he subsequently passed away in her arms. Valeria heard a loud thump from behind her. When she turned around, she saw Berger lying, at an odd angle on the ground. He had apparently tripped and fallen while walking toward her. He was also dead, and when she went back to check on her son, she found that he had also died of sadness. She had sunk to her knees, apparently unaffected by whatever it was that had killed the rest of her group for the next 2 days, hemmed in by bad weather and unsure of what to do next. She'd huddled up with her blanket and the family's gas burner before finally descending in search of help. When the rain stopped, autopsies were done on the bodies of the 3 people who had died. The results were not clear as to why they had died, and there was no evidence that a crime had been committed. In the years that have passed since the tragic event, no more research has been done on it. Very few theories have been put forward to explain what might have happened, and those that have been put forward have been shown to be very weak. When you look at this event, you can see that the people who died had 2 things in common. The first thing is that all of them were men. The second is that they all drank from Valerius's hip flask of cognac. If we believe what she says, she is the only one in the group who didn't drink any of the brandy. Because of this, she is being looked at with a lot of suspicion. In the years that followed, people thought that Valeria wanted to kill her husband and son so that she could get her husband's money or run off with another man. People think Valeria put something bad in the brandy so she wouldn't have to deal with the shame of getting a divorce. She might have done this so she could give it to her family at the right time. This plan was somewhat ruined by Vasar Berger, and he may have refused the brandy altogether, at which point she hit his head with a rock so that no one would see. It's a plausible explanation, but one which falls apart under closer scrutiny. First of all, there is no clear reason for it. If she really wished to inherit her husband's fortune, or eloped with a hidden lover, why kill her own son? By all accounts, Valeria was a loving wife and doting mother, entirely happy in her marriage. After her husband and child died, she fell into a deep depression and didn't get married again for a long time. There's no doubt that a genius had a lot of money, but many people don't believe that his supposed fortune was real. There was no vast wealth of malaria to inherit, and she had neither the constitution nor motivation to murder her family in cold blood. So instead, could the prosecutor have been targeted by criminal or even political elements within his community, who poisoned the drink without his or Valeria's knowledge? It's not hard to think of why someone would want to kill someone of his size. If he had taken legal action against the wrong people, he would have lost. But this seems like a really bad way to kill someone. Why go through the trouble and risk of poisoning a hip flask that belongs to your target's wife? It would have been much easier to fake a failed robbery in a remote mountain pass. Any way you look at it, the postmortems are the real killer blow to this theory. Even though the contents of Valeria's hip flask were never tested, it was clear from the autopsies that all three deaths were caused by pulmonary edema and cardiac arrest. There were no poisonous substances found in the blood, and all three of the people who died were already in bad shape before they drank the brandy. Even though we agree that Valerius is all we have to go on in this case. Another thing that came out of the autopsy was that Genius had a heart defect that no one knew about and that his son's heart showed signs of the same disease. It's possible that some biological change that happened during the trip caused both the father and son to have heart attacks at the same time. However, the death of Vasar Berger seems to contradict this idea. He was healthy and fit, and there was no sign of a health problem. So why did he die with the same symptoms, as shown by the autopsies? It seems likely that the three people died from AMS, or acute mountain sickness. Even though this happens more often at much higher elevations, it has been known to happen on smaller peaks like those in the Tatra mountains. The symptoms that came up in Valerius's account of the deaths are the same as those that show up in severe cases of this condition. But the time limits are much too short. Most of the time, it takes hours, not minutes, from the first sign to death. At lower altitudes, this process takes even longer. Because of this, people rarely die from AMs at such a low altitude, less than 5% of cases end in death. Basically, what we have is a very rare disease, and the fact that it killed three people at the same time at a high altitude makes it even rarer. As pulmonary edema is very individual, this would never be heard of in the mountaineering world. Usually, it doesn't happen to everyone in a group at the same time. On top of that, Vasar Berger was an experienced climber. As a veteran of the Swiss Alps, he should have had no trouble in the Tatra mountains. It is a mystery why he was affected in this way. If the deaths were caused by something in the environment instead of something biological, like an aerosol or a vacuum made by the strong winds, why did it only kill the men in the group and leave malaria alone? Could there be a biological process in a man's body that turns on under certain conditions that we don't know about? It's possible that giving people alcohol only made this problem worse. This is, of course, just a guess, but some of the more outlandish theories point out that other deaths involving men, low temperatures, and small amounts of alcohol, like those found in the canals of Manchester, England, and different parts of the US, have some of the same characteristics. Even though it's interesting, this link is at best weak, but it might be worth more research because there is so little evidence to go on because of how the event happened and how much time has passed. Unfortunately, theory is all that can be used to explain what happened, whether the cause was natural or man-made. It's hard to look past the sad deaths of the people involved. It is possible that in the future, we will learn more about mountaineering, and the risks that come with it. There may be a new way to explain the deaths that happened on that terrible summer day. For now, all we have left is a long-lasting mystery that doesn't make much sense. May the souls of these unfortunate hikers rest in peace, and may their deaths help solve the mysteries of other deaths in the mountains one day.